Good day, LML4807 student. Today's lecture will relate to the topic of financial inclusion. You would have seen in your study guide that this is a very short lesson, so we will only have a few slides on this topic as part of our online lecture. After you have completed this lesson, you need to achieve 3 outcomes. The first outcome would be to be able to define financial inclusion, which would be the opposite of financial exclusion, as a policy objective towards economic growth. Secondly, we want to also make sure that you are able to identify different aspects of the normal banking regulation, which might create certain barriers for financial inclusion. And lastly, we want to also make sure that you understand which supervisory requirements concerning deposit-taking institutions may have an impact on certain people not being able to access financial services. Now, financial inclusion can have many definitions, and if you've done a bit of reading on financial inclusion, you would have seen many definitions exist. Now, the definition provided would depend on the perspective of the person providing that specific definition. For example, would that person consider geographical proximity of a service provider, or would they consider socio-economic aspects, which can include a customer from taking part in the financial sector? Some definitions also then specifically focus on the exclusion of certain vulnerable groups from the formal financial sector. For us, to make it simpler for you, we provide you with the following basic definition. Financial inclusion for us means the process which would ensure the ease of access, availability, and usage of formal financial systems by all members of a community. Now, these words I've highlighted on this slide will be explained a bit further in the discussion to follow. When we talk about dimensions of financial inclusion, we look at 3, namely access, usage, and quality. Now, when I talk about access, I mean the ease of availability and the appropriateness of a financial product or service, which would be a financial product or service of reasonable quality. In this case, emphasis would be on certain barriers which may exclude a consumer from accessing these financial products and services. Now, access obviously is the first step in providing financial inclusion. Now, the next dimension is usage. Obviously, I can have all the access in the world, but I must actually, as a consumer, use or consume this financial product or service. The question we're asking ourselves here when we discuss about or have a discussion about the dimension of usage would be, how much would a client actually use this financial service or product? In most of the literature, you would have seen that access and usage cannot be separated, because access without usage is absolutely worthless. It does not help if you have a product, but a consumer is not using it. Now, obviously, again, we have all the access in the world, and a consumer might use a product, but the product that they want to use needs to be of a reasonable quality. In the end, it's worthless if you have access and you use a product, but that product adds no value for you as a consumer. Now, with financial inclusion, you must think to yourself that this is a concept that's not been around for that long, and it's only been the buzzword in the last few years. As all things in life, there must be a balance. And it could happen that in order to achieve financial inclusion, you might have to lower compliance with other objectives that might be important to the financial sector. In the end, there must be a win-win situation, but you are walking on a tightrope sometimes, because in order to achieve financial inclusion, you must ensure that you, if I may use the word, relax the standards which promote financial stability or financial integrity or consumer protection. So in the end, it is about finding the right balance between these or principles when you're weighing them up against each other. Obviously, you cannot disregard financial stability, financial integrity, or consumer protection in its entirety. So you can imagine to yourself that financial institutions are consistently trying to find ways how they can balance achieving all of these objectives. Indeed, not an easy task for them. Now, the first barrier to financial inclusion could be having to achieve financial stability. Now, when we talk about financial stability, you would have heard this word quite a lot, especially in the last few years. Financial stability has become the buzzword in the financial sector, especially after the global financial crisis of 2008. Financial institutions must, for example, look at how do we grant credit. So if you have a trade-off between financial inclusion and financial stability, financial institutions must be careful to see how can we grant more credit to certain groups of people. So how do we include them in the formal sector without compromising the financial stability of the entire sector? Again, as I've mentioned before, this is not an easy task. Then we talk about financial integrity. Now, financial integrity would obviously link to the concept of the prevention of money laundering. And money laundering we will deal with in another lesson. You might have heard, or you might have experienced it personally before, that you would go to a bank and you want to open a bank account, but you do not have the proper proof of address. You might be renting, you stay with your parents, or you might live in an area where you do not receive a municipal account to provide as proof of your residence. What do you do in this instance? Because without it, you cannot open a bank account. Also, thinking, if you are a person or a foreigner, to what extent would banks open up a bank account if you don't have a permanent address? Indeed, these are also considerations that form part of that trade-off that consistently takes place between financial inclusion and certain barriers. The last barrier might also be the element of consumer protection. This boils down to the consumer being protected against themselves, but also against banks. So consumers not becoming over indebted, so not borrowing too much, but also that banks do not make use of irresponsible lending practices. So you want to include certain individuals as part of the formal financial sector. So you, for example, want to give a person a credit card. But to what an extent can you provide a credit card to a person where that person fails to provide sufficient proof of income? This is definitely a catch-22. Now, there's been a lot of transformation taking place in the financial sector to include the concept of financial inclusion. We've provided you with a bit of a historic discussion on page 67 of your study guide. Please read that for yourself. As this is theory, we are not going to go into a detailed discussion in this online lecture. What we will point you to, though, is the common bond exception, which you would have come across in your reading when you prepared for lesson 2 already. Now you can think to yourself, and I have mentioned this before, that banks are highly regulated, especially in South Africa. So immediately, if an institution or a group of people meet the definition of that business of a bank, then you immediately ask yourself, should this not then be, or these activities be regulated under the Banks Act or the Mutual Banks Act, for example? Now, can you remember in lesson 2, I talked about the concept of stokvels? And do you agree with me, if you've read the part on stokvels again, that stokvels would amount to, for example, a deposit-taking institution? Now, can you think to yourself that if you have an informal group of people establishing a stokvel, that they did not, or they would not want to also be recognized as a bank and then have to go through all of the regulatory requirements of one of our banks in South Africa? And this is exactly where the common bond exception comes through. So, for example, if you have a stokvel where the subscriptions are below 30 million, that stokvel need not register as a bank, even though what they are actually doing is still a business of a bank. This is an example where you can actually see creative ways of introducing or allowing individuals access to something that would have formed part of the formal banking sector. Another example relates to certain of the provisions that's contained in the National Credit Act. Now, the National Credit Act we'll look into again in your lesson plans to follow. But just to give you a brief overview of some of the concepts that some of the concepts that were incorporated as part of the National Credit Act, with a view of also transforming the financial sector to allow for financial inclusion. Firstly, we have a concept of reckless credit, where under certain instances it can be found either by a court or the National Consumer Tribunal, and after the most recent amendment also by the National Credit Regulator, that the credit granted by a credit provider amounts to reckless credit. Now, obviously, this is quite a severe statement to make, or find that a credit agreement was granted recklessly, and there would be certain consequences attached to such a credit agreement, which we're not going to go into today, but we'll discuss again when we get to the lesson on credit agreements. Then also, there's some form of affordability assessment that must be conducted before you conclude a credit agreement. Now, you might have read in popular press that there's been a lot of debate on the nature of this affordability assessment, especially after a landmark case against Truers. So, what should be considered as income, for example, if you open up a Truers account or you acquire a credit card? If you cannot provide formal bank statements and you might be a day laborer, what do you provide then as proof of income? This question is still not resolved. And this will be discussed again when we look at credit agreements in a lesson to follow. For the purposes of today, just be aware that affordability assessment, or the requirements for the affordability assessment, is an example of where the financial sector is consistently transforming to allow for financial inclusion. Then, you would have also read somewhere, and you might have even experienced yourself, that there's a cap on fees which a credit provider might charge if you open a credit card, or if you bought a car, or if you were so lucky to buy your first or your second house. A credit provider can only charge a specific fee, and those fees are usually determined by publication in the government gazette. So in recent years, there's been an amendment of the fees that credit providers could charge on credit agreements, for example. Now, there are only some specific or listed items which can be seen as cost of credit, and for this purpose, you'll see later on, also when we get to the lesson plan on credit agreements, that Section 101 of the National Credit Act specifically provides a list of those items that might form part of the cost of credit. So in that sense, we can see where certain provisions of the National Credit Act has allowed for the transformation of the financial sector. Also then, to allow for more people to enter the credit market, but protecting those individuals when they take part in the formal credit market as well. Now, I hope you would have picked up from the lecture today that the topic of financial inclusion can actually go very well with a question dealing with the Credit Act, or even a question on money laundering. So in your preparation, make sure that you do not prepare the topic of financial inclusion in isolation, because it interacts with those other topics. And not be the person that is surprised if we ask a question on financial inclusion, but incorporate something on money laundering, for example. In the end, everything needs to integrate. So the knowledge you get should not be seen in isolation. It needs to be practical. Again, we have our contact details for you on the screen. You are welcome to contact us with any questions about the presentation today, or also if you have questions about the module content in general. All of the best with your studies.